Hello, everyone. My name is Kolia Souza. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Food System Equity and Advocacy Specialist for Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems. I co-coordinate the Michigan Local Food Council Network alongside Keesa Johnson, who will be co-moderating today's webinar. As we're getting started, please, all of you take a second to let us know who you are and where you're from in the chat box. So this webinar, Laying the Foundation for Equitable Food Assessments, is the second in a series of 3 discussions exploring community food assessments. These conversations intend to explore the process of creating a community food assessment using an equity lens, from the basics of an assessment to foundational concepts for centering equity in the assessment process, to how to use an assessment for transformative community change. During our first webinar, we discussed how to use systems and community development frameworks to guide and make sense of the information collected through the assessment process. And today, we'll talk about foundational elements for assessments, such as overarching frameworks, power dynamics, language, shared definitions and agreements, and resources. Keesa, I'll have you click to the next slide. This series is a collaboration between Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems, Food Communities Network, which works across Indigenous territories in Canada, and the Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Futures Food Policy Networks project. We will be recording this webinar and we'll share the recordings with registrants at the conclusion of our series next month, along with any resources we've collected along the way. Let's go to the next slide. So as always, a few housekeeping notes before we get to our presenters. So during presentations, we ask that you keep yourself muted, but everyone is welcome and encouraged to use the chat box to comment on the presentation, to engage one another and share resources. We'll also have the Q&A function available for questions you may have for the presenters. We designed this webinar to be really interactive. So following each of the presentations, we're going to send you all to small breakout rooms with a few discussion questions, and then we'll debrief when you get back. But we'll end this webinar with a panel discussion among our presenters where we'll get to any questions you've dropped in the Q&A box. So we can go ahead and stop sharing the slides. Keesa, thank you. But all of that being said, I will introduce our first speaker and she'll be able to take a moment to get her slides set up. So Yulia Chuvileva is a cultural anthropologist specializing in food systems in the US and Guatemala. She is the senior advisor to Ignited Word, a Black-owned, majority-woman social sector consultancy based in Atlanta, Georgia. Ignited Word works with nonprofits, funders, and other groups on imagining, bringing about, and measuring joyful food futures. And I'm going to drop Yulia's contact information in the chat box in case you want to reach out to her, along with a link to Ignited Word. So with that, I'll let you take it over, Yulia.
Thank you so much, Kolia, and thank you everybody for being here and for the opportunity to share some of our work with you today. And I'm glad to have gotten an introduction because that can save us some time. So for today's menu, in keeping with our food theme, I'm going to skip the introduction. I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of the place of community and food assessment. So rather where I feel like it's often lacking. And I'll give an example from my work in Guatemala, then another example from our work in Atlanta, which is where I'm based right now, before we wrap up. So in my work, so I earned my PhD in cultural anthropology from Emory University in Atlanta, and I lived and worked for over 3 years in Guatemala in total, working with indigenous communities and collaboratives that are trying to improve local food systems. And in that process, I've done some food environment mapping to really try to understand what is going on in a food environment in the city where I worked. And what I often see are that when we do these kind of community food assessments, that ironically, often the community is missing. We focus a lot on the retailers that exist. We might also focus on the food that the retailers provide or other entities might provide, like food banks. But we often don't really say, well, who are these people? And what does it mean for them to be providing the kind of food that they're providing in any given community? And how are they doing that? And how are they being supported? Which is also often a different kind of a community that's embedded in supporting all of that activity. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, kind of some of the pitfalls of missing those pieces of the community and some of the tools that can be used to make sure that we're bringing that back in. So let me talk to you about one way that people go about understanding, measuring food environments. So people either might do some counting on the ground, walk around neighborhoods and just see what's available, or they might use existing data sets. So there are some national data sets available from the USDA and other data sets. And there are other tools available that can help you make sense with some of that data. And I'm going to just talk about one set of them, but there are many. And the set that I want to talk about are called the Retail Food Environment Indices. And there are a few versions of this, but we're just going to call them RFEIs for short. And the thing about the Retail Food Environment Index is that it takes what 4 different categories of particular kinds of retailers and categorizes them as either healthy or unhealthy. So it will, somebody using an index like this might either look at it in the neighborhood for themselves or take a national data set and say, how many fast food outlets are there? How many corner stores are there? And I'm going to count those as unhealthy. How many supermarkets are there? How many farmers markets are there? And I'm going to count those as healthy. Then a specific score is calculated, the RFEI, which is a ratio of how many unhealthy outlets are there to healthy ones. And then labels are attached to those communities. So if a community is pretty much lacking healthy retailers, then that community might be called a food desert. Or if a community has a ratio of about 4:1 of unhealthy to healthy, or a little bit more than that too, then that community might be called a food swamp. And we can have a whole side conversation about problematic nature of labels like this for communities, which we can later. I won't go into it, just want to acknowledge that they are. And I saw, after my fieldwork, a study that was published that looked at Guatemala City in Guatemala and an indigenous community of Chisec that applied this index to try to understand whether or not people live in food deserts or food swamps. And I honestly did not recognize the Guatemala that I knew in that data. And so the paper that I ended up writing was based on my fieldwork in Quetzaltenango, also known as Xela, which you can see is west of the capital Guatemala City on this map. And this city is majority indigenous in Guatemala, 65% indigenous. And as I mentioned, this was kind of a 12-month stint of fieldwork that's part of over 3 years of work I've done in the country in total. And I walked around and I mapped anywhere that I saw food being sold or advertised in the central zone of the city to try to understand its food environment. And when I took my data, which included over 700 points in my data set, and I just applied the 4 categories of the RFEI, this is what the map of Xela looked like. And for anybody who's colorblind, I'm so sorry, this map is not, the colors here are not accessible to you. And it's just, these are early maps that I did. I haven't had a chance to redo. Apologies. But for everybody else who can see it, you can see that anything that's healthy is in green and any dot that is red is unhealthy. And in this map, it's mainly corner stores. There's 127 corner stores in the area that I mapped. Now, the problem, as you can imagine, with using just these 4 categories is that it leaves a lot of other activity out. And in total, I found 10 to 12 different categories of stores and retailers that this kind of an approach leaves out. And I'm just going to share a couple of those with you. RFEI in these 4 categories, they miss all sorts of specialty cuisine restaurants that tend to serve up pretty healthy food and that are also independent. The RFEI misses these kinds of comedores, which are eateries that are typically run by women, often by indigenous women, serving up really healthy dishes, traditional dishes from the Mayan cuisine in Guatemala. And it also misses things like tortillerias, where women make by hand tortillas 3 times a day that are healthy and that are needed and providing a very important staple for food security in the country. The RFEI also misses all kinds of outdoor activity, and that's a big part of how food is offered in Guatemala and many places, New York and other places. This is everything from kind of stalls and where women are serving up freshly squeezed orange juice, or even sometimes junk food. But whatever it is, it misses this whole realm of activity that's happening. And because it predetermines retailers as healthy or unhealthy without really looking at what they're offering, it also counts corner stores in Guatemala as unhealthy. And that can really marginalize corner store owners and the stores themselves, because the policy recommendation coming out of an RFEI analysis like this one is that you should work with corner stores to make them more healthy. But actually, we found healthy foods are available in almost 40% of the corner stores in Sheila that we measured. And again, those were typically offerings that women made, that they cooked and provided food, whether that's lunches or chiles rellenos, which are stuffed peppers and other things. So all of that is missed. So when I took my data set and looked at it just if you count the RFEI categories, this is what the map looked like. This is what the map looked like when we counted everything. And you can see that's a pretty stark difference between that map and this one. There's a lot more offerings. There's a lot more mixed kinds of offerings. And you can see here that we added a category of orange, which is mixed or middle healthy, because you couldn't always say if something was completely healthy or unhealthy because people offer mixed foods available. But your recommendations are going to be very different if you see Shayla this way compared to if you see it this way. And some of the recommendations might fall from additionally looking at, well, who is providing what in this food environment? And if you look at just what food industry contributes to Shayla, and just look at kind of the big industrial products, the chain stores and chain restaurants that might be around, this is more or less what the contribution is. And you can see that it's mainly red and orange, so unhealthy to mixed healthy offerings. If you look at what women contribute to Shayla, it's mainly green and a little bit of orange. So mainly the most healthy and middle healthy or mixed healthy options. So again, when you see Shayla this way, you might decide that we need to uplift women's efforts and the culinary labor that they provide to actually provide a nutritional options for people in the city that is otherwise inundated by unhealthy industrial food options. So that's one piece that I wanted to share with you. And we did end up publishing this, so I can share the link with you after this as well, so you can read all about the study. But the second thing I wanted to share with you, another part of the community that is often missed, are beyond the retailers and the foods, there are so many other organizations working to make a food system happen on a local level, especially ones in the US that are focused on alternative, sustainable, local agroecological food systems. And we at Ignited Word, instead of going or walking around and trying to kind of see the retailers and stores, just used available information online about organizations that are working in Atlanta. And this is the map that I'm going to show you using a platform called kumu.io, which is a completely free and accessible, incredible platform where you can do a lot of systems mapping, social network analysis, causal loop diagrams, however you're trying to make sense of and visualize systems data. It is a great tool to use. It is one of the easier ones to learn and to teach. It's not a huge learning curve to be able to start to use it. So highly, highly recommend it. If you ever need help with this, we can always help you. But for now, let me talk about the Atlanta food map that you see here that my colleague Abby worked really hard on. So first, this data is very incomplete. We just did a web scrape of just the most obvious players and the kind of relationships that they report on their websites. So a nonprofit might put that they fund particular farms and that they get funding from the government and that they have other partners that they implement a food bank program with. We took that information and we put it in this map. So first, you can just see who the players are supporting the Atlanta local food systems. There's a big circle of nonprofits. There are several farms. There are a couple of farmers markets at the top here. On the yellow on the bottom are funders. You've got businesses on the left in black, government in blue, and co-ops and alliances in red. So then you can see all of those folks together in kind of like this big community. But the really fun part is drawing connections between them. So when we put how folks are connected, this is what it starts to look like. And there's so much that you can do with a map like this. And let me just show you one more thing real quick. We can size the dots that you see, and each dot is an organization of some sort, by how many connections they have. So this in this map, you much more quickly can see, well, who are the main players, at least who are the most connected. So Foodwell Alliance is an organization that is really well connected, or Elemental Impact that kind of connects, this cluster in the middle and a cluster of their own. So if you are trying to be strategic about shoring up this system or learning more about it, you needed information about how local food works in Atlanta, you might go to those two organizations for that. Or if you were a funder or a farm trying to connect with people who provide funds for farms, you could use a map like this, because you could see, for example, oh, interesting, this organization here, Compost Now, has relationships with 3 farms, the green circles that you see. Or Atlanta over here also has a relationship with a farm that is also connected to Foodwell Alliance. And if you are a consumer looking for support, looking to access food banks, a map like this can show you where to go. Or if you're a funder looking to see which part of the food system is not being well funded that might need extra support, you can use a map like this to do that. And as I mentioned, it's fairly easy to use and be able to get started. And I'm pretty sure my time is up and I've gone over, but happy to talk about so much more of this. But as I mentioned, what I hope to really demonstrate is the way that you can really put community back into food assessments if you look for things in a particular way, and just make sure that you're asking about who is involved in the food system, not just what is there.
Everybody. We hope you had a great time. We had that great presentation by Dr. Yulia. She let us see data in a different way, to hear a narrative that's quite often missing in community food assessments when we talk about joy. So anybody want to give a share out from the 2 questions that we posed? Come on, we're here to talk.
Ina, you like to share, or you and I can start? Because we are 2 people working together. Yeah. So hi everyone, my name is Ashrafi. I'm from Toronto, Fred Victor Center. So I'm working the environment. I'm just my designation for work. I'm garden and food skill facilitator and coordinator at Fred Victor Center. So my work is more like a hands-on gardening, like a grow food and hands-on cooking program. So I meet one of the person. She's very nice, and she working in Michigan, and she's a dietitian. So I gain knowledge from her. And the first question we actually discuss, and you see time is very quick. So they actually working some food demo for the participant for healthy food. And we also find out something similar. I also organize some program, is called the Healthy Plate. So we teach the participant the portion, the nutrition fact, and how they make some healthy nutrition food. And also our side, we teach people the food, how to control the food waste and food insecurity environment, and also the the produce food and some local farmer we can support to buy some local food. So then is two benefit. One is we get the fresh food, another one is we support our local farmer. So that 2 thing, and the connection for the thing, we have a some local community organization. We always partnering and sharing, if I have expertise for the food skill and the growing things, so then another agency have some facilitator. We have a one local community health centers. We always get dietitian from them. So that's the way we can make a connection and we can do program together. So sorry, I talk a lot. So if anyone has any question, let me know. But I'm so glad last minute, but I did it. I attended the thing. Yeah.
Thank you. Someone had their hand up.
I saw that I think Nikki Siebert might have had her hand up a little bit earlier. I don't know, Nikki, if there was anything you still wanted to share.
Yeah, I did. I had a great two different folks with me that joined me, and we were talking about, answering this question around joy. I had Casey and Rita in the group with me, and we came to some consensus on two things. Number one, it becomes increasingly challenging the more you become administrative and the less boots on the ground that you are. So it's like finding joy and authentic connection virtually because you're working at a desk versus being boots on the ground. It feels like it comes more naturally. And the second one is like, if you've been trained in assessment through a white supremacy culture, and you're having to constantly check what is considered a best practice. Yulia, your presentation struck me because I also did mapping, and the one thing that got cut out of our budget was ground truthing for locals to do ground truthing. And it ended up feeling like the resulting map wasn't really going to be authentically serving the local communities, because you can Google any of the stuff that was in our map because that data is public. So it was hard to find joy in creating a product that didn't feel like it truly served those who needed the service the most, including the businesses, women-led businesses who need the business the most. So those are the two pieces that we really took away from that. I really appreciated the conversation. Thank you for the chat, y'all.
All right. All right. I take it over to you, Kolia. I think we should be moving on. Is that okay? Or did anyone else? Are we good?
We got a couple of comments in the chat box too, from Sarah and Mo.
Okay. So Sarah said one thing about the group considered how to put some of the awesome ideas into practice in a practical way. Something was touched on through collaboration. For example, collaborate with local community organizations, local governance, and others. What we find when we begin to converse together is that we often are more alike than we are different. That is, we often have similar goals and values. So finding other organizations who may not be doing the same work, but similar value. What you do is one solution. Okay. And doing mapping is a great instance where you can find valuable assets, as this work is often resource heavy and time consuming. Yeah, it is. Yep, and Mo said, oh, identify, focus on ensuring joy is a part of the assessment. I'm not sure we have yet intentionally incorporated elements to generate and experience joy. Mostly has come out of connection with others to move things forward. This has reminded our team to incorporate this element more intentionally. All right. All right, so we got some great ones. We do have another breakout that's coming up, but we do have another one presentation as well. And then we have the panel discussion. So we want to make sure we keep our conversations rich. So I'll pass it over to you, Kolia, to introduce our next speaker.
All right, thanks, Keesa. And I see that you guys are continuing to engage in the chat box. Please keep it coming. But I will get us on to our next presentation with Bridget Igoe, who is a strategic advisor at the City of Seattle's Office of Sustainability and Environment. She advises on programs, policies, and investments aimed at supporting a more equitable, sustainable, and resilient local food system. She leads the city's food action plan and monitors Seattle's sweetened beverage tax food security investments, working in close collaboration with other government staff and community partners. And Bridget has a background in public health, public policy, program implementation and evaluation, global health, and nutrition sciences. So over to you, Bridget.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. A couple of us were talking while everyone was in the breakout rooms that we wanted to join because I know that there's so much experience in this space right now. I'm going to skip over my little introduction to save time. Thank you so much for doing that for me. And just a quick check, you are seeing my screen, right? The PowerPoint application?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to be talking today about some of the key features that we use to update Seattle's Food Action Plan. Our Food Action Plan is a vision and roadmap for an equitable, sustainable, and resilient local food system. It outlines strategies and actions that the city is taking alongside literally hundreds of community-based organizations and partners to realize this vision for our local food system. And one of the roles that this plan plays too is to guide our programs, policies, and investments across between 5 and 9 different departments. So we've had a food action plan in Seattle since 2012, but recently we went through the first ever update of this plan. And so that is a little bit what I will be sharing about. It's very related to, I think, what it's like to do a community food assessment. The food action plan is oriented around these 4 driving goals. These were the same goals that were identified in 2012 as well. So increasing community food security, supporting locally grown and traditional foods, advancing an equitable local food economy, including fair labor, and preventing food waste and climate pollution. And in our updated plan, we have outlined 47 actionable strategies and priorities. And they're organized around these 8 different categories. So we are calling these in the updated plan strategic priorities. And so if you go to the plan, you'll see that those 47 actions are sort of nested under these categories. These categories, by the way, came directly from some community engagements that I will touch upon later. Before I just go straight into some of the key features of our process, I did think it was important to give just a little bit of background information about City of Seattle's food policies and programs, because really this update process was building on decades of work and learning and investment from the city. So I'm just going to try to go through this fairly quickly. But I'll start by sharing that since 2010, the city has had an interdepartmental team that helps to guide and implement the food action plan. There are key representatives from the 9 different departments that you see here who manage food programs or manage programs and policies that impact the food system in some way. And what I am presenting today and all of the engagement I'm presenting is really guided by a team of folks. So I wanted to recognize them here and also to just show the diverse nature, I think, of food systems work. And that's why there are so many departments involved. Within those departments, we have kind of 3 core food types of programs. So food and nutrition security, food waste prevention, and urban ag and community gardening. And I'm going through this because I want to just show you sort of the ecosystem of Seattle's food work, because all of the dozens upon dozens of community-based organizations and community leaders who co-implement these programs with us were involved in this update process. Our food and nutrition security work is supported by a mix of funding, and it really is implemented in a variety of different locations throughout the city that reflect sort of the our life course approach to how we implement food and nutrition. So anywhere that people may already be accessing services, or where they're going to school, or where they're working, or where they're playing, or where they're worshiping, is where we try to co-locate our programs. It's important to note that we are really lucky. We have $15 million a year that we can invest in this work because we have a sweetened beverage tax, and we use the revenues collected from that tax and reinvest it into the food system. On food waste prevention, we have a variety of initiatives focused on preventing food waste in businesses and households and residences, and also food rescue innovation work, which is trying to capture high quality surplus food before it goes into the compost stream and redistribute it to those in need. This is supported by our solid waste fund. And on top of this, we have really robust food waste diversion policies and programs. So we have citywide composting services and laws on the books that say you cannot throw food waste into the garbage. And then finally, urban ag and community gardening has been a really important part of the local food system here in Seattle. We have a pea patch community gardening program that just celebrated 51 years in operation, an urban food systems program where we are activating public parkland and publicly owned green spaces to be able to enable community groups to steward that land and grow food. And we support a variety of community-led projects through a tapestry, I would say, of city grant programs. So there's a lot of urban ag and community gardening happening as well. We work really closely as well with Office of Economic Development and Labor. OED, Economic Development, permits our farmers markets and our food trucks and some of our smaller food businesses. They provide a lot of technical assistance to food entrepreneurs and small food businesses. And then Seattle labor standards and ordinances are, some of the most progressive labor standards in the country and really do impact and protect the 23,000 food service workers that are just within city limits. We heard from community engagement as well that addressing labor in the food system, fair labor practices, was really a priority for communities. So I wanted to take a moment to mention that. And then with planning and community development, food is peppered throughout the Seattle comprehensive plan, and it's really a core feature of some zoning and land use codes, especially as we're describing what urban agriculture looks like in the city. And we have an equitable development initiative, which is a grants program that helps community groups actually acquire and purchase land. And we've had a couple of major food initiatives that have won significant funding through this program. So the update of the Food Action Plan really was building upon all of this work that is happening right now in community and through city investments and programs. And, again, huge team of folks who were behind this effort. And so just a quick slide for some acknowledgements. Now I'm going to get into the actual update process. So this was a pretty substantial process that lasted about 3 years, and I'm going to start by showing you an overview of that process, and then I'm going to dive into some of the key features that were really the foundation to how this all unfolded. We started this process in 2021. We actually started in 2029, right before COVID, and as all best plans that were laid during that time were kind of just shoved aside as we responded to the COVID emergency. But we really restarted in 2021. And we did a lot of foundational work to set a shared vision around how we wanted this process to look, what we needed to hold sort of as our North Star as we engaged with community. We did a substantial literature and data review that I'll touch upon. We had an environmental justice committee in Seattle who created food justice values, which became really core to how we implemented this process, and they're featured in the final plan. And we did a number of racial equity analyses, which I'll touch upon as well. All of that foundational work really guided the way we designed our community engagement strategies and who we engaged. We did in-depth interviews with community leaders, many focus groups and listening sessions, a number of writing workshops to help develop draft content for the updated plan. So we were not wordsmithing in a group, but we were doing, collaborative writing in group spaces at some points. I put a link in here where you can get more information on some of the engagement, and I will touch upon this in a bit as well. After we had done that really focused community engagement, we did do a small opportunity for public comment on the draft plan. Or it was around this time that we were also still working with Seattle's Office of Intergovernmental Relations to invite tribal engagement from our area's federally recognized tribes, the Squamish, Muckleshoot, and Snoqualmie. Then we started to, again, lots of co-writing, incorporating final feedback and edits, many rounds of briefing with city leadership. And then we just released this updated plan a little more than a month ago, and it was adopted by City Council by a resolution. So lots of links in here if you want more information. So I'm going to try to, as concisely as possible, talk about what I think were some of the key features of this update process. And the first thing was really paying super close attention to how we were going to kick off the process. 2021, when we were really organizing ourselves, if you all remember, this was an incredibly poignant time. We were working against a backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, the summer of racial reckoning in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. We also had several extreme weather and climate change events that happened in Seattle around this time. And so everything was just really exposing the disproportionate harms that communities of color and lower income communities were facing. And I guess it's just accentuating this like persistent, entrenched pattern of racial disparity that we would see across any indicator that we looked at. So we knew that we really needed to start this process with a lot of care for where people were at, the context that we were working on, but also the change we wanted to see, because at the same time, there were incredible food and environmental justice movements across Seattle and the US that were really growing and reflecting this rise in leadership of our frontline communities who are developing solutions and really building their capacity to lead the change we wanted to see. So it was important that we really held both the challenges that we were facing at this time and acknowledging the strengths and assets that we saw in community. So all to say for this slide is that, really paying attention to that kickoff and really having some high engagement workshops and meetings that were designed to instill joy in the process, going back to your breakout session prompt, and build those relationships and just draw out people's best, most generative thinking. And then, of course, articulating goals and roles and expectations and gaining support from city and community leaders in this process. We also did a pretty robust literature and data review. So I looked and compiled sources of information from a lot of different types of data, reports, program data. We have some amazing local news outlets that are constantly reporting on food justice efforts around the city, peer-reviewed papers, community engagement findings, disaggregated data on key outcomes. I mean, we really, really wanted to do our homework, so to speak, so that we could add value in this process and figure out, okay, is there data that we don't have? Who hasn't been consulted yet on some of these issues? And the idea here too also was to promote shared understanding of these issue areas with all of our collaborators. This data helped to inform the development of a community engagement plan. It helped to inform our racial equity toolkits. And one of the techniques that I used after compiling this data was really to have a couple of workshops with the collaborators who led this update process to get them all to really understand what they were looking at in this data and in these stories that we were hearing from community, and using a lot of methods to kind of prompt active reading and discussion amongst ourselves so that we could really get into the deeper work that would be needed. Another key stage was this articulation of shared values. So around the time that we were beginning to organize the city team, Seattle's Environmental Justice Committee, who we work really closely with, we have quite a few really influential boards and commissions and committees at the city, and they heard wind that we were going to update the food action plan, and thankfully said, we want in on this. Like, this is super important. And so they developed a set of food justice values, and I invited them to come to a interdepartmental team meeting, and they took about 3 months to develop these values. And when they presented them to the city team, people were just blown away. And they really are bold, visionary, aspirational principles that describe the change that we need to see in the food system and why we need that change. And the city team asked with their permission, like, can we use these to help guide our process, guide the content that's going to be in this plan? And we're so lucky that the EJC trusted us to use this as a tool. And then we also developed, as city staff, our own set of sort of stewardship values. So if we thought about the EJC's values as like, what is the change we want to see? The city values were, how are we gonna go about this? How are we gonna work together to try to realize this change? And I know that creating values and vision statements and all of that can feel really performative, but if you do this well and you use it at every critical stage in a project, it really does, in my experience, help to set the direction and drive alignment across a project team. And so I'm actually a really firm believer in values development, so long as you are going to use them and really like test your deliverables or whatever you're working on against those values. And in this case, it really was a great way to center community voice and connect our process directly back to some community priorities. I'm almost finished here. Another key stage in our process was to do racial equity analyses. City of Seattle has a very standard but important and embedded throughout all of our departments way of doing racial equity toolkits. It's just a way that we systematically analyze what the racial equity impacts of our work is going to be, whether it's a program, a policy, a major change, and to really examine who would benefit and be burdened by that work. So we did 2 different racial equity analyses, and but then we wanted to go deeper. We also worked with our Office of Civil Rights and did a root cause analysis of some of the inequities that we were daylighting through these racial equity toolkits. This, I think, can also be a really, really important stage in any assessment, so long as this is not where you stop. Like, you can't just sort of do this assessment and say, okay, we checked the box on this. It's like, okay, now how are you going to integrate that? And what is the change that you're going to try to create based on what I say and what I've heard from colleagues say, all this damage data that we have just had to sit with. So all of that foundational work, those values, that reviewing data and other community engagement findings to make sure that when we went out into community, we were going to be adding value and not asking a bunch of the same questions that have already been explored in community. Those racial equity toolkits, all of this went into the design of our community engagement strategy. I encourage you, if you're interested, to go to the website. We have all the reports from this effort on the site. We tried to engage with a variety of food system leaders who were authentically representing the communities most impacted by the inequities we saw in our racial equity toolkits. So we really did identify key subject matter experts and community leaders from all parts of the food system. We used a variety of ways to engage, so in-depth interviews, listening sessions, focus groups. Many of these were co-designed with community consultants to make sure that we were doing this well. But we still also had, in every instance, staff there so that they could like really listen and hear firsthand some of this feedback. We compensated folks $100 per hour. It was so important to me to compensate our community leaders for their wisdom and expertise and time at rates that were commensurate with some of our consultants, because that's what they are. They are community consultants with really deep expertise on food systems issues. And I mean, the goal here was to really make sure that the updated food action plan could lift up and reflect and integrate the priorities and solutions of frontline communities. The last thing I'll say is that when it came to the writing process, this was really an iterative and collaborative process. So I used a variety of ways to have different rounds of drafts that people could react to, could annotate, could map back to specific engagement findings. We have some versions of our early draft that are literally reference where this input came from the community engagements. And then again, we were constantly testing for alignment against our values, against the EJC's values, and what we were seeing in those racial equity toolkits. And collaborative writing can be very time intensive, and it can feel like honestly, like not the most efficient way in the moment, but that's not the point. The point is not to be the most efficient. You're trying to avoid this echo chamber of just one person's perspective coming into this assessment, and really trying to share the power that's going to in framing the content. And I do think we have really amazing shared ownership of this final product. I know this because shortly after releasing this, and it's a long plan, it's 120 pages, I had several people write me and ask like, oh, we changed the way we refer to our program now. Could you change that? It's on page 62 of the plan. It's like, wow, people are reading and they're looking for themselves in the plan. Lots more links. I'm sure I've gone over time, and I apologize for that, but happy to answer questions and engage in this next part of the discussion. Thank you.
Hey, well, Kolia, I'm gonna pass it over to you. We get into our panel discussion.
Yeah, so I was in a breakout room for just a moment. Really rigorous, wonderful discussion that I think is going to lead very nicely into our panel discussion now. So let's start out with this, Yulia and Bridget, thinking about language. And of course, I want to invite those in the audience. If you have a question that you want to throw out here, just raise your hand and we'll get to you as well. But starting off with language, the language that we use is really important in framing community food assessment and other initiatives that impact communities, and terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion, justice can easily become watered down in practice and perpetuate the status quo. So how have you seen this play out in institutions, and what has the impact been on communities?
I'm happy to go first. I really appreciate that question, because I think there's always kind of a tension, right? We know, especially those who work in the social sector, who do this kind of work with communities, part of communities, that language is very important. It is how we express ourselves. Tells us a lot about the assumptions we're making, and it can be re-traumatizing in some ways. And I've seen definitely in some of the larger institutions that I've been engaged with, really concerted efforts to address this, to educate ourselves about different terms and what they might mean in different places, and become more inclusive in the language we use. The pushback always is, is this the kind of language police, right? Everybody has to tread carefully around everyone else, which I think is a valid critique, in that we're all on a journey and we're all learning. And I think if people trip up or use kind of the wrong word in the wrong place, there's also kind of a responsibility to call people in rather than call people out, to help all of us along. So I think there's two sides to that. And specifically in food assessment work, I mentioned in my presentation terms like food deserts or food swamps being really problematic. And it's communities who highlighted this, right? Saying that food desert makes it seem like our community has nothing to offer, that it's barren in so many ways. And, as I showed even in my data, often the kinds of assessments that those labels are based on are so problematic themselves and don't capture a lot of what's going on the ground. So a corrective to that is actually to call out the systemic factors that affect a place's ability or availability of nutritious, culturally responsive and meaningful food. And that's to call out food apartheid, to say we're not a food desert with nothing going on. We're not even a food swamp, which again kind of has negative connotations, but we are stuck in a structure that is not allowing us to express the highest food values that we want to express in our community. And what do we do about that? So that's like a very specific example. And I want to kind of bring this back to Atlanta too, you know, the maps that I showed you from Guatemala and how they relate to even here in the US. So very similar kind of tool like the RFEI was used to mark whole sections of Atlanta as food deserts, specifically in our west part of the city. And the city of Atlanta devised a plan to bring a mobile farmers market to this area, or actually, it was, sorry, less mobile and more at a train station nearby. And it did that without consulting anybody locally. And by doing that, they didn't realize that there were all these organizations already on the ground working for social justice. There were Black farmers with community-supported agriculture schemes supplying local residents that did not have access to otherwise fresh fruit and vegetables with those. And they didn't see any of those efforts because their tools were blind to that. And so this market they wanted to set up was going to actually compete with ground-up local efforts that were already happening. So it's you know, that label of food deserts coming from categories that were not resonant with the community in terms of who's providing what in terms of food locally was really almost damaging in this space. And luckily they were able to actually, somebody pointed this out to them and somebody, you know, they connected with local efforts to then find a more amenable solution. But that's like the power of those words, right? And in our case, and for discussion in this room, the power of the methods and the numbers that go to create those words that are also could be problematic and need to be unpacked and addressed when we're thinking about food assessments and engaging locally.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We have we heard this a lot during the Food Action Plan community engagement. We have sort of a section within our plan that talks about the problematic term of food deserts. And just to add on to what you're saying, Yulia, it's not just that you know, that it conjures up this sort of barren, destitute, desolate place, but it's also that food deserts are actually like natural ecosystems where there is a lot of thriving that happens. And what we see in areas that are termed food deserts in mapping or other assessments is not a natural consequence at all. Like this is, it's actually reflecting these human-created environments that are result from racist and classist underinvestment in these areas. So yeah, flipping the way we describe things to really then get at root causes and what we need to do to address them. To your question though about you know, sort of these what can happen when, you know, there's the term greenwashing, and I think equity washing is really related to that. So actions that appear to be aligned with equity, but can really sort of be used as an excuse to avoid the deeper work that we need to do. And so having worked in many large institutions, City of Seattle, state institutions, even large NGOs, you can see a lot of sort of DEI work, like maybe there's a DEI committee that gets formed, or there's an equity assessment, but then nothing is done as a result of it. There's lots of trainings or book groups that form, but again, there's not that deeper work to actually address and advance equity. And so I think this does play out in a number of ways, and it absolutely is, as you said, Yulia, I think it can be re-traumatizing, and it doesn't get us anywhere good. I think it actually deepens disparities, and so I think it's looking at what is the deeper work that we need to do as a result of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And it is not to downplay the importance of those efforts. We need to be doing equity assessments. We need to be doing that self-analysis and having those discussions with one another about the role that we play in this. But we can't stop there. And we need to push internally in our institutions to make sure that we're really doing that deeper work.
And let's go a little bit deeper into this concept of language and get into narratives. So narratives can play a really important role in how we think about the systems we're a part of, including communities. So could each of you speak to the ways in which you've seen narratives show up in community food assessment and the impact that you've seen those narratives have on the process?
I'm happy to give this one a start as well. Again, kind of thinking to my own research, right, and the work that we've done, where when you look at the few maps that I shared today, right, one that uses this like RFAI categories, what that looked like compared to the whole map, compared to what it looks like when you look just at what the industry contribution is, and then compared to what that looks like when you look at the women's contribution. Each of those has a story and a narrative that goes with it. And the vast majority of kind of like published research tends to go towards that first story. We'll use these like big clunky categories that actually have a lot of assumptions and biases built into them, right? If you're focusing on registered businesses in many places, you're going to miss a lot. If you're focused on indoor businesses, you're going to miss a lot. If you're focusing on large scale chains, you're going to miss a lot. And all of that points a bias towards measuring a bigger footprint kind of a business and what's available in your food system compared to a lot of other stuff going on. And it's part of like this story that we end up telling ourselves about what is and isn't a food desert or a food swamp, and how that can be flipped, and how important it is to flip that with these alternate narratives that unpack those assumptions, that break down the categories a bit more to look a little bit deeper. And often, I do a lot of work in public health, and public health kind of sometimes sees itself or likes to see itself as a theoretical field, but does not realize that often actually a lot of the theory and assumptions are built into what's being done and hidden underneath what are seem to be kind of impartial tools. It's just a tool, it's just data. But all of that is humanly created, and we're all political, imperfect, biased creatures. And so we propagate those biases in the data, in the methods, and then the narratives that we tell about them. And those are really consequential because we base policy decisions on them. We base practice decisions on them. We base how we think about, understand, and whether we respect or not communities that we are working with. And so they're really powerful, right? And it takes sometimes a lot to kind of shift it. And one of the ways that can be done is from what I've shared today, right, and I think part of one of the central themes of all of these discussions that we've had are, and that is centering community, starting with the community, getting really understanding what that community looks like, feels like, wants, desires, needs to have, and starting the story from there, not from a top down, we have a tool over here that we want to apply to your community, or we have this over here and we want to see how you fit in, but starting the other way around, kind of ground up anthropologically, to me, can really help shift those narratives around what we're looking at.
I have just two quick thoughts on this, because I think Yulia said some really wonderful things already. When I think about how narratives can show up in community food assessments, the first thing that comes to mind is, again, getting back to racial equity analyses and looking at disparities data, is that we can't just focus on that alone, because I think that can create this narrative lacking, or communities that have less because they have been underinvested in due to racist and classist practices. But if we were to flip that and really see communities and groups for their power and their expertise and the solutions that they are leading with, I think we would really sort of start to promote very affirming stories about what we see and what's working. And that's what we really need to uncover here, is like, what is working and how can we amplify that? So that's one thing. And then the other thing that comes to mind, just building off of this conversation we're having around mapping and food deserts, is that when we think about food access and how the GIS mapping and food desert research from 2009, when that term first came into being, it really focused on like geographic access. But really, when we think about food, and so then we got into this whole like, oh, we need to like build a bunch of grocery stores everywhere. And geographic access is absolutely important, but there are so many other more nuanced domains of food access that have to be considered in assessment. Is it affordable? Is it culturally relevant? Is it accommodating to the people who need to access that? And so I think I know we have a question about some of the disadvantages of mapping, but we need to be thinking about food access in a much more nuanced way. And so the language that we use to talk about food access beyond just mere proximity and geography is going to be really important.
And I hope y'all are noting the comments that are coming through, everybody here in the chat box. So panelists, I know we're in the middle of a discussion, so you might not be able to get to it. That's fine. But everyone else, we've got some really great comments coming through. But yeah, to your point, Bridget, about mapping, for example, and the tools that we use, they can definitely influence our processes. So in both of your experiences, how have you seen tools help or hinder equity-centered community food assessment?
Yeah, I'll just build on what I was saying. I think mapping it can be very, very important, but it's only one of many, many tools and methods that we need to use as we're thinking about a food assessment, because GIS mapping alone cannot get at all those really important elements of what actually facilitates access to food. I mentioned some of them. And what Yulia demonstrated really well in her presentation is that it will miss critical points of food access, because mapping is going to kind of rely on like the dominant systems and structures out there, like it's some sort of database that is based on certain permitted types of retailers, and it's not going to capture some really important assets in community that exist and are core to food sovereignty efforts and food access efforts, mutual aid efforts, community gardens, food stands. So I think that a mapping is here to stay. I think it's useful. I think it can be particularly useful if you overlay it with like some racial and social equity indices, and you can kind of see like where are there gaps in some of your resources, but it cannot be the only way that you assess community food assets, because it will miss really important information, and you need to ground truth that information, and you need to go talk to people. You need to get out in community and talk to people.
All the things that Bridget said, and in addition to that, because I think, well, I want to uplift what Wadia is saying, which was kind of going to be the point that I made. And she said, as with all data, who determines what info should be gathered, revealed, etc.? What's the purpose of the data? What are the outcomes, deliverables? I think tools are amazing. We have such incredible tools these days for anyone who's not even, trained in data. That make being able to engage with them so easy, that you can visualize all kinds of different systems and places and all sorts of things that you want to put out there. You can, but the question comes down to, how is it all designed? What is it for? Who is it for? Who is involved? What are the questions being asked? What are the what are the ways that the data is being represented? Who is in it? Who isn't in it? Who is it being shared with? For what purpose? Like all of those really important design questions is where I think the legwork of making sure that the tools are being used for maximum good, however you define good in that sentence, is where the work is. And I think, I love using tools. And Bridget, you mentioned this a little bit in your presentation. I get so much reward and so much joy from showing people themselves in the data that we're collecting, engaging them, just like, I don't know what this means. You all told me this. This is what we have. What does this mean? What do we do about this? What's missing? What's not? And as Bridget mentioned, that really drives a lot more authentic engagement where people own the project that you're a part of. And tools are really helpful to that, right? Like, and that includes working with multilingual communities, with communities where maybe you're even working with low literacy levels and things like that, where you can visually show things that would otherwise be written in complex peer-reviewed manuscripts, where the tools become alive and can be used a lot more. So I think it's how we use them and what we use them for and who makes those decisions is where you can meet or undermine your equity goals.
And to Bridget's comment in the chat box, rest in peace, Google Jamboard. But luckily we've come up with a lot of other tools that can be used. But Bridget, you spoke quite a bit about your experience working at a municipal level. And, oftentimes we hear about histories of mistrust between communities and government, institutions, et cetera. Could you both speak to how you navigate this tension within the community, and how do you negotiate those tensions within governments and institutions?
Yeah, I mean, the mistrust is real and it's deserved. So I think it's just really acknowledging those past harms and sitting with that and having to, I know this is kind of a coined phrase that gets used a lot, but it really is, I think, so accurate, which is like moving at the speed of trust. And so it's going to take time with certain community leaders and community groups who have been so harmed by institutional practices and government practices. And it doesn't matter if you as an individual did not do that. You're still part of a system and an institution. And so I think it's just really having frank conversations and listening, just listening and first of all, making sure you're not perpetuating any of those harms, but honoring the fact that the mistrust is deserved and it's real. And I think over time, as continuing to show up, continuing to listen, to follow up, just to when I'm working on a deliverable, I'm always really iterative, and I follow up and I say, can you check my work? Did I get this right? What's missing? And having that kind of transparency in the process and that follow up, and managing expectations when there's going to be feedback that for some reason you cannot integrate, but explaining why. People just will, in my experience, like if you are honest with people and open with people and do that deep listening, you can slowly start to rebuild at least trust in the process that you are leading. I don't have much more to say on this. I mean, it is such an important issue, and it's just like, I think we all just have, if you're part of and backed by a major institution, you just have to recognize and know about the histories of harm.
Yeah, again, kind of ditto to everything that Bridget said. And, again, I'd say that people are actively trying to grapple with this, right? And they're on their journeys as well. And again, kind of absolutely, one of the things, the death nail in any kind of relationship is to kind of see that mistrust as, judge that mistrust, right? So like, well, why don't they trust like everybody else trusts these institutions, right? And to really recognize that there have been historical injustices committed against communities, and we're still learning year on year of worse and worse things that have happened, that have been covered up or glossed over, or maybe even acknowledged, but it's still there in community memory, historical memory, shared memory. And one of the structural difficulties that governments and others face, and I would say the funding community, which actually is in a better position to address this than the government, the cycles of funding, right? 1 year, 2 year, 5 years max is what a grant or a cooperative agreement might be worth. And although people can get refunded, depending if the program is something that's ongoing and has cycles all the time, but often they're not structured, those kinds of grants are not able to support the kind of long-term community engagement and trust building that can then ultimately overcome some of this historical trauma, or at least become those trustworthy partners and communities where that work can get done. So that's a major, major barrier to this work. And I think philanthropy is in a better place to address it because they're not confined in the same way. They don't have to be. They have more choice to say, you know what, we're going to engage in a different way. And then, of course, you know, when you also have grants and other things that have a lot of strings attached with a lot of top-down, kind of like, we know the exact strategies we want you to, exact topics we want you to work on, exact strategies we want you to employ in your communities, when what the community needs and wants in that moment might be really different, then you're not being responsive, and you kind of are perpetuating that harm because you've decided before engaging the community what you want them to do. So there's always this tension between funders and power holders, and even when they say we want what's best for the community, there's still often an assumption that they are the experts on what's needed. And rebuilding some of that trust is letting go of some of that. And there are movements in philanthropy and unrestricted grant giving, for example, right, of trying to support more operations in organizations. Like, everybody wants you to do the impact work, but who do you know, how do you think that happens? What do you think keeps the lights on? And often that's not funded. So there are movements to try to address this. And one of the things we talked about earlier, right, of like trying to find joy in this and focusing on assets and what communities already have. And somebody in the breakout room said that, you know, we try to do that and then we didn't get funded because the funder said, well, it looks like you have it figured out and you don't need the funding. Like, wow, how much education is needed for the power holders, right, to even flip to this perspective. But as I said, these perspectives exist. There are alternative models that exist, and there are big movements to try to move in this direction in grant giving and philanthropy. And that's good, but it's going to take such a long time for that to ultimately turn into trust, where trust has been broken.
Yeah, when the systems that we have in place don't align with the desired outcomes, or even when some of those outcomes are reached and then these systems just really don't play well with where things have shifted to. So Yulia, you are an advisor with Ignited Word, and Ignited Word is about imagining, bringing about, and measuring joyful food futures. So bring it back full circle to what you just brought us back around to and answering the previous question. Could both of you say more about the critical role of joy, play, and imagination in community food assessment?
Yeah, I'd love to start this if you don't mind, Bridget. Yes, you know, we've been thinking a lot about this. And one thing is, you know, I think a lot of us are brought to this work through the experience of negative emotions, right? Of feeling annoyed or frustrated at the injustices of the world, or feeling disgusted by what we learn about where some of our food comes from, or feeling sick to our stomachs by understanding the environmental impact of, you know, our food systems, feeling scared or outraged, right? These are all good emotions in the sense that they galvanize us to action. But if that's all we have and we continue to reinforce that day in, day out, we're going to burn out. And we're going to either burn out and leave, or check out and leave and just decide to do something else. So for us, kind of tapping into play, imagination, joy is what's going to make this sustainable. And where can you have any more joy than in food, right? Like, we all have memories around connecting through food with our families. And this work should be fun, right? Like, we're bringing about something different. We make things better. So for us, we choose to deploy joy in kind of like a counter narrative, right? To bring that full circle to what we constantly hear and all the reports that we read, right? Like, they're important, they have their place, but we don't see as many joyful reports and so as many joyful headlines about food systems and the work that we do. So the way that we very practically get involved in this is, so we have a few offerings that we engage in. One is, you know, for organizations, teams, groups who maybe are kind of like stuck in the problem mode, and maybe want to really reimagine in a playful, brainstormy, kind of out of the box way, what is this even for? What are we truly trying to bring about? And what can that look like? So kind of imagination workshops like that, where we can talk, facilitate teams through doing that, unlocking their imagination and imagining joyful food futures. And as I mentioned, I really love bringing tools to people, and having people see themselves in their own data brings them so much joy, and then brings me joy, and then everybody wants to be involved, and everybody wants to be like, hey, I'm not on the map, bring me, my partnership's not on the map, put this there, right? Like it's kind of like a virtuous cycle that's really exciting. So that kind of systems mapping, social network analysis is another really big part of our food systems offering, is to engage folks in that, and then to use that to strategically drive their agendas and to build the movement. What else do we do? I have like a whole list of things that we try to do. I'll just do one more, and that is joyful communication. So again, like any research project that we do, how can we use comedy, art, other fields to more positively and communicate what we're finding, what we want to bring about, our advocacy work, especially through comedy. I've done a little bit of stand-up comedy of late to try to really get into that space, but it is such a leveler, right? Like people are so much more open when they're laughing, and you can make the same point, but reach people differently if you're using the same statistics, but making a joke out of it, making it a safe space to laugh at this absurd situation that we normally all know we're in. So that's the other piece, is engaging artists, comedians, and others to help us communicate messages in a different way. So those are the three things, but all in order to offer this corrective to a field where I think we're really mired in negativity.
I love everything that you just said, Yulia. I don't have too much more to add to that, but I guess what I'll say is what I heard in your response and what I thought about in this question is that in the context of a food assessment, where you're probably bringing lots of people together to look at data or to get into this generative space of what are solutions, what's already working, I think that it's just really designing the activity and a workshop, whatever it's going to be, but try to do that in a way where your goal is just to, how am I going to get people's best thinking? How am I going to draw that out? Because there can't be joy if there isn't like a safe space, a comfortable space, a space where people really feel seen and heard. And that can take a lot of work to figure out how to create that space to get people's best thinking, where they can tap into play and imagination and joy and the generative work that needs to happen. And so, using techniques like Yulia mentioned, and just really paying attention to how you're curating your assessment and these experiences, because then that's also how you're going to develop the relationships. So I can't say enough about, I almost to a fault, like overthink and overplan how I engage with folks, but it pays off because people's time is so valuable. And their wisdom and expertise is so valuable. And I always see my role as just like, how can I work with collaborators to design the structures to really pull out that wisdom.
Yeah, these processes like community food assessment, it's not just a means to an end. Everything is an opportunity to say, how do we build relationship and deepen connections? So that's it for some of our prepared panel discussions. And Karen, can you take us off spotlight and put us back with the whole room? I want to see, do any of you have questions or comments that you want to put out in this space? There's been some really, really good conversation happening in the chat too. Yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
So first, I just need to say thank you. This has been incredibly rich. My name's Michelle. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from Treaty 7, also Canada, Alberta, Banff. And you spoke a lot, and I mean, this is where we spend a lot of our attention, is these equity seeking folks and groups who we do have trust with and are willing to share and be advocates for themselves or allow us to share their stories. I'm just wondering on the other side of it. So as decision makers and folks with power and privilege, and we spoke about this in one of our breakout groups, but how do you help relieve the hat of label, role, and decision maker and bring the human back into this human problem, just so that that lived experience can resonate? I just know from my own lived experience, there's certain groups and things I didn't get behind until I knew someone. And then it was like a direct relative, chosen relative, but that I needed to advocate for because I can now feel the lived experience that was part of their life and I can hold space for that. But I'm just wondering, like, how can we get decision makers to do the work we're doing in that limited space and time, with sometimes those hats so stuck on the head that they forget their names and where they've come from. So yeah, and I know moving at the speed of trust will have to go both ways. So really easy when you're taking that time for design and bringing people along with you, but then how do you make sure the ears and the hearts in front of you are really hearing and intentionally feeling the potency of what we're doing?
I mean, Michelle, I think you just answered your own question, which is that it goes both ways. And I think for each of us, right, we work up and down and across, however you want to slice the hierarchies that we inhabit. And I've definitely found in my work that I have to be just as thoughtful, intentional, and patient with leaders as with anyone else, to try to, again, understand them, right? Like, what are the hats that they wear? What are the lenses through which they see? Where are their blind spots? And how can I convey an idea to them that might sound like the language might just sound weird or triggering or even completely irrelevant to someone else, but to them, it's going to hit the right notes. So there's kind of, I think you have to, if there are decision makers you're trying to influence, you have to think about them in that way too, and also recognize that they are also just human. And often, like you said, the hats can be so stuck on, especially in people with power, where you kind of want them to have a bit more humility than they often do, right? And that's like a really key practice, I think, for all of us, is humility, is never putting yourself above someone else, like, because you do that and you will lose trust. But kind of come back to your question, I think it's, yeah, like, to me, it's that you have to be just as strategic and time and invest just as much time if they're the people that are gonna, for better or worse, in this moment, if you can't change that structure and they're going to be the one calling the shots, then you've got to put in that work of appealing to them in the way that you would do in the really community participatory process, like seeing them part of that community and as someone who holds the power, and working with them in that way is one way.
It's so true. I mean, the same way that we talk about curating and being so intentional about how we're reaching out to community, it's the same way internally into the institution, and really learning about who is the decision maker, who is that decision maker influenced by, what do they care about, and then kind of matching that to be able to persuade. And I think that this is, to that question of power and privilege, as a white woman at a major historically white-led institution, I have a lot of power and privilege. And so it's like, how am I going to use that in that internal work to amplify and elevate and recommend what I'm hearing from community? And so I often do find myself, and I have to position myself in places where I can lift up a recommendation And I do it in a way that I think is going to be as persuasive as possible for that decision maker. So yeah, the intentionality has to be all the way through. And, you know, at one of my collaborators, co-conspirators, as he says, is really into sports, and he calls it the inside-outside baseball. But it's like really working from within, and also like interrupting when things internally are kind of going awry. And I do recognize that this takes a lot of power and positionality as well, but learning how to slow things down or interrupt in a way that isn't going to put people on guard, but just sort of remind people that, you know, we have a race and social justice initiative at the city of Seattle, and we are committed to X, Y, and Z values. And this recommendation or this approach is what's going to align with that. You know, just really having to use a lot of different strategies too, and communication techniques. So
I just want to just point maybe to one difference between what we think we're trying to do here, right? Like, I think when you're really committed to a community-based, engaged, whatever the term is, approach, you are trying to be maximally open to influence by the community. You're trying to kind of do their bidding, right? Like, you're trying to uplift their needs, their voices, whereas when you're working upwards, you're trying to be the influencer. You're trying to open up to hearing that. So maybe even though the strategies might be the same for getting to know and taking your time and being strategic, there's a difference in what you're trying to do. You're trying to be influenced up and influence up, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that really good question, Michelle. I think we have time for another question. Any comments? Perhaps as we are getting ready to close, I'll just share that to what Bridget and Yulia were just now speaking to, being open in spaces, being willing to interrupt with compassionate accountability is really important. And even in our monthly network call for Michigan Local Food Council Network this morning, we made open space to talk about the impacts of white supremacy culture and how it shows up in our personal lives and in our professional lives. And, you know, even one thing that I have thought about personally is, okay, a tool that gets used in professional spaces, a resume, adding something about my lived and personal experience in there to blur the line between what's personal, what's professional, what counts as expertise and knowledge. That I have been a single mother that's used public benefits to get through college to take care of my two daughters, just so it's understood that, you know, you use this as a tool in a professional space. Well, this is real and valuable experience, and to make it less taboo to speak to and put things like that out there. So I think we're about 2 minutes from closing, and I want to take a moment just to thank Bridget and Yulia for a really, really engaging and thoughtful webinar. We could have easily kept this conversation going for another 30 minutes in more spaces. And thanks to all of you here in the audience for your engagement in this session as well.